you wanna grow your list size, pop up like it's hot, pop up like it's hot, pop up like it's hot. And when you gotta boost your revenue, pop up like it's hot, hey, pop up like it's hot, pop up like it's hot. Pick your favorite template, you can tailor to your brand. They're MailChimp-erific, you're gonna be a fan. MailChimp your marketing with our new customizable pop-ups.
With a major selection of the looks your kiddos love starting at just $4 in the Walmart app, a new school year means a stylish new them. Who knew? Find skater skirts and Crocs that say, I'm casual but cool. Sparkly sneakers that say, it's my classroom, you're just learning in it. And preppy polos that say, I'm the teacher's pet, even if they're mommy's menace at home. Find their favorite styles starting at just $4 in the app. The Walmart you thought you knew is now new.
This is the Tudors Dynasty and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back to Tudors Dynasty and Beyond. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and I'm so excited today to welcome to the show for the very first time, Dr. Emily Lalande. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on.
So I recently saw a post that was shared on Instagram by Dr. Estelle Perronc about your PhD thesis and the topics, and I got so excited because you wrote your thesis on two pretty amazing women. And maybe before we go into today's topic, you can tell everybody what your thesis was about.
Yeah, so my thesis was about the political careers of Marguerite d'Angoulême and Marguerite de Valois, who were both queens consort of Navarre and I would say just as importantly, French princesses, so sisters to French kings. And so it was really looking at their political careers through the scope of how they wrote, so their life writing, how they wrote to people, how they wrote about themselves, how they wrote in fiction, how they wrote in memoirs.
This is so exciting because on this show, we love talking about women in history. And I feel like so often I neglect the French women because it's just an area that I'm not as comfortable with. So when I saw that you had done some research on I see, I'm trying here. When you had done some research on Margaret of Angoulême, I was like, oh, this is a lady that I want to know more about. When I think of her, I see that beautiful portrait, I think with the red background and the parrots. Yeah. And I want to dive into her with you today. And I want to kind of let's start from the beginning because there might be a lot of people listening or watching right now who don't know her lineage or her background at all. Could you give us a little recap on who she was?
Yeah, so Marguerite d'Angoulême is the daughter of two really interesting people who were located very close to French royal power, but not necessarily in seats of power themselves. So on one hand, we have Louise of Savoy, who is an incredible woman who was basically Duchess of Savoy, which is an area kind of right now between France and Spain. I believe it's in France now, but yeah, very close to that. Oh, no, sorry, not France and Spain, France and Italy.
Oh, okay.
Very close to the border of France and Italy. Yeah. So like quite close to like where you would say like Nice is now and everything.
Okay.
So she grew up actually because of her proximity to France. She grew up in the French court. She grew up in the court of Anne de Beaujeu is her name, or Anne de France, who was the regent of France for her younger brother. And so she grew up in this French court that had a bunch of young women studying together, learning together, and everything. So Louise of Savoy grew up in France, and when she was 14, I believe, she was married off to Charles of Angoulême. That's where Marguerite d'Angoulême comes from, her father, Charles of Angoulême. Charles of Angoulême was the great-grandson of a French king, so he had this blood tie to the Valois dynasty. He was basically very close to the line of the throne at the period of time that we're talking about. The dynasty was really starting to struggle. I mean, when Marguerite was born, the French king, I believe, was... Let me just look this up so I don't get the wrong Charles, because we have so many Charleses at the time. We have...
It's like when we talk about English history, we have a million Margarets to compare.
I know. And here we have so many Margarets as well, but those I'm a bit more familiar with. I'm always more familiar with the women than the men.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, great. So Charles VIII was King of France at the time. And so he was that younger brother of Anne de France, who I was talking about. And so he didn't have a male heir. So at the time, next in line was his cousin, who was Louis the 12th, or who would become Louis the 12th. And so again, Louis the 12th, you would see struggled then to have an heir as well. He had two surviving daughters, and so that was it. Like there was no real male French heir from the direct kind of Valois dynasty. And so what happens is Charles and Louise de Savoy marry, and then they have two children. Their first child is a daughter, Marguerite d'Angoulême, and then she has a younger brother, François d'Angoulême. Basically, from the beginning, it's really a small contained environment. They live kind of out in the countryside. They're not at French court. And what's really scandalous about where Marguerite grows up is that her father has his mistress living with them and his mistress's children being raised alongside of them. Yeah.
Awkward.
So it's a very awkward, very interesting family dynamic, but at the same time, and I mean, you really kind of have to commend Louise of Savoy for that. She seems to have gotten along quite well with the mistress. And again, like even after Charles d'Angoulême dies, Louise kind of keeps his mistress in her household, keeps the children together and everything. So as awkward of an environment it is, it also seems to be quite loving in its own way. So that's who Marguerite is. She has the blood of basically French kings through both parents, multiple generations back, but most especially through her father.
And I love it because I feel like most of the time people know her because of who her brother was, Francis
Yeah.
the First, and that's a shame because she was her own person in her own right. And we're gonna delve into that more today because I think I
Yeah.
learned a lot more about her. One of the things that I found a little bit interesting, you mentioned that she got married in 1509, right?
Yeah.
And so, of course, then I'm thinking about Tudor history, and 1509 was significant because that was the year that Henry VII died and Henry VIII became king. And, you know, he was with Catherine of Aragon. And
Yeah.
this is the same time she is getting married. Can you, I don't know if maybe, could you paint a picture of what things looked like in 1509 in France?
So in 1509 in France, you have this kind of, I wouldn't say necessarily completely stagnant society, but it's not as kind of flashy as and exciting as the court of like young Henry VIII would be. And so there's a lot of parallels that get drawn between Henry VIII and Francois I because both of them become these young, virile men, like really bringing like kind of glamour and glory and glitz and all of that to their respective courts. So at the time in 1509, the French court is quite a quiet place. I mean, we have Louis the 12th, who's king, and then we have Anne de Bretagne, his queen. She is this amazing woman also who is such a powerhouse, but was quite a pious and dour woman. So their court wasn't really at the vanguard necessarily of kind of culture at the time. They had two daughters, again, like I was saying, Renée de France and Claude de France, and neither one of them are really old enough to be making a splash of their own. So we have Marguerite, Marguerite and Francois are in the periphery of the French court, I would say. They're kept very close by the king because, again, Francois is really his heir. Like, he is the next in line to the French throne. But then at the same time, they're not really given a spotlight. So we have these two young people who have kind of all this freedom outside of court. But then at the same time, it's not really freedom. It is very restrictive. They are where they are. And so what's interesting about Marguerite is because, again, she had this royal blood. One of the original, she does eventually marry Charles d'Alençon in 1509, but before that, she was actually brought forward as a marriage candidate for Henry VIII, the young Henry VIII. At the time, there was talks after her father died of her mother, Louise of Savoy, marrying Henry VII as his second wife, and then Marguerite marrying the young Henry VIII. So she is this heiress. She does have a certain glamour kind of going on for her because she's this figure on the international scene. She's kind of the woman in the middle of all these marriage talks. But then what ends up happening is her marriage prospects are really kind of culled by the King of France, who says there's an inheritance question going on with Alençon and everything. There's a sort of struggle going on between Louise, who has a claim to some of the land over there, and then Charles d'Alençon. And he's like, we're just going to resolve this by marrying Marguerite over to Charles d'Alençon. So really, Louis the 12th, his court in France was all about kind of shoring up French power. I mean, again, it's kind of not that far after the Hundred Years' War ended. So we're really dealing with a France that's really focused at this point on kind of national recovery and national unity and putting everything kind of together. We don't really get, again, that like flamboyant kind of like almost internationalism that we get later on with François the First.
Right. Which honestly was only what, 6 years after her marriage that he became king, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so before we get into that, how old was she when she got married to Charles?
I believe she was about 20.
Oh, okay.
So she wasn't a kind of notoriously young bride. She was about, I would say, let me get my numbers straight. No, she was 17. So again, she was young, not quite as young as we'll see some of the other kind of players in these stories. I mean, again, her mother was married when she was 14.
Yeah.
So Marguerite was a little bit older, not at all like approaching like old maid territory or anything. This was a totally normal time for a woman to get married. But just for her, it was quite difficult. She spent her childhood really in this weird environment where she's with her brother and her mother, and then also for some time her father's mistress and those children kind of under kept under lock and key by the French king, this and that, kept close to royal power, but not actually there, but still close enough to court. And then her brother also has all these young, dashing, glamorous men kind of around him, like um, we have Anne Montmorency, who becomes really a huge figure later on in the reign of François. We have the Seigneur de Bonnivet. We have all these, again, dashing young men around François. So Marguerite is used to a certain lifestyle like that.
Hmm.
And then what happens is in 1509, she's 17. She's really kind of like at the cusp, I guess, of adulthood at the time, even though, again, like right now, you're like, well, she's just a teenager. And then all of a sudden, all this excitement, all this kind of waiting on like tether hooks to see if her brother's going to become King of France or not, kind of all comes to a halt because she's married off to Charles d'Alençon, who lives far out from court, who is not really involved in a big way, is not a big name player. And so this kind of promising career, again, this woman who's used to being around, or this girl, I should really say, who's used to being around all these kind of like burgeoning stars of the French court,
Yeah.
all of a sudden is married off to someone who A is not like that himself, and then B would not be around those kind of people either.
Oh, must have been such a change for her, like just a shock to the system.
Huge change. I mean, what's really interesting that happens is that she moves into his castle with him. And there's this really good book by Ruben Chalakian and Patricia Chalakian, and they really write about Marguerite's development kind of emotionally through her writing. I believe it's called Mother of the Renaissance, or Mother of the Reformation, sorry. And she, at the time, became really good friends actually with her mother-in-law. So her mother-in-law becomes this kind of real source of support for her while she's away from court. She grows very close to her mother-in-law, and her mother-in-law is a very spiritual woman. And this is really where you see Marguerite, I think because she's away from all the excitement from all, I mean, she was super educated. She had all access to all these books and everything. And then once she leaves from the Loire Valley, she doesn't have access to these same things anymore. She turns to her mother-in-law, who becomes her confidant, who is very spiritual. And then Marguerite herself starts to become quite spiritual.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
She is so fascinating. Like the more I learn
Yeah.
about her, I'm like, she was an amazing woman that we don't talk about enough. So I'm just so glad that you're here today to talk about her.
Thanks.
So I want to get back then to Francis the First becoming King of France
Yeah.
and Marguerite returning. Like she
Yeah.
is at court. How did that even come about? Because you would think she's married, she has this husband, the husband rules everything, right? That's just how it was in the 16th century. How I do, is there any evidence of how she was able to convince her husband?
I mean, the situation really was that by the time that François became king, she didn't really need to convince her cousin because her brother was the king. Her brother was the one who wanted her there. Like, what you really need to understand about Marguerite, and what I think a lot of people do understand about her, obviously, is that she was very close to her brother. Again, they grew up in this situation that really only the two of them and their mother could understand.
Mm.
I think there's a lot to say about how both him and their mother depended on Marguerite and how Marguerite depended on them. I think, when we're looking at the period of time before Francois became king and they're all really waiting, and it's like everybody's kind of fortunes depend on Francois. At the same time, everybody's depending on Francois, but who is Francois depending on for emotional support? That's his sister. That's kind of his best friend. You're growing up together. You're very
Yeah.
close. No one else can understand what you're going through. Obviously, at this huge moment of victory for you, of glory, who do you want to be with? Your best friend, your sister. Obviously, his mother's there. Louise is always going to be there. She was super close to her children. Both of them, even though obviously at the time, I mean, she was closer to François, as you kind of have to be as a mother at that time. Again, all your
Yeah.
prospects, all your other children's prospects depend on that son. So Marguerite was it was just natural for her to go to court as soon as he became king. He wanted her there. She wanted to be there. Like it's not really a situation where she was called there against her will, but it wasn't either a situation where she had to beg and plead to be allowed to go there. It was
Sure.
just natural. They call themselves this like trinity together. Like they're like almost like a holy trinity, mother, son, and daughter.
Yeah.
They are 3 points on a triangle. As soon as again, Francois didn't really have say over his own life while the old king was still alive. It was really when he became king that he started to really have a major say in his own life. And so that paved the way for Marguerite to go to
Mhm.
court.
When she went to French court, did she bring her husband with or did he stay behind?
He went with her.
Okay.
So he does really, what's really interesting about her first marriage is that not overly too much survives about it. I mean, we don't have any letters from him to her or her to him that have survived. I mean, if we do, they haven't been found yet.
Hmm.
However, like what we can glean about her husband is that she writes about him. I mean, she does clearly care for him and at least a certain respect later on, later into Francois's reign. He really gets into hot water and she's there advocating for her husband to her brother, like trying to kind of offer mediation between the two of them. But, at the same time, it's not a love match. They're two kind of mismatched people. I mean, from all that we know about Charles d'Alençon, it's not like he has a flourishing literary career like Marguerite did. It's not like he was necessarily known as like a huge war hero, like anything that would have necessarily attracted her to him. Doesn't mean that they had a horrible marriage or anything. It just means that even when he came to court with her, he was never really destined to be like a shining star of the French court.
Okay.
So it's kind of not so surprising that we don't have too many traces of him there.
Yeah. And they didn't have any children, did they?
No, they didn't have any children. They really, I mean, Marguerite struggled. She wanted to have children. I mean, again, like that's
Mm.
kind of your duty as an early modern woman.
Yeah.
She was going to spas and baths and seeking those kind of treatments. But they did not have any children together, no.
Mm. That's it's
Yeah.
too bad. But she ends up having children later on.
Yes,
And
yes,
that's
with her second husband.
yes, and I want to talk about this because her husband Charles died in what, 1525, 15? Yeah.
Yes. So like a month after, yeah, the Battle of Pavia.
Okay, and I so want to talk about Francis the First and him being in captivity.
Mhm.
And before, because I really want to talk about her involvement and all that, because that is just, it's mind blowing to me because that would have never happened in England. But I think, um, can you elaborate a little bit on why, like what happened to Frances? Why did she end up being involved?
So Francois ends up he's embroiled in these Italian wars on the peninsula. It's really, I mean, it's through Italy, but it's really about the balance of power in continental Europe, with the Holy Roman Empire, which is getting huge. I mean, obviously, this is at the time really where Charles V is becoming a massive, massive figure on the international scene.
Yeah.
So Francois, like I was talking about, the previous French court was very much focused on France itself. Francois, his whole young idealistic soldier thing is he wants to go out, leave France, get more territories, get France to be a lot bigger, a lot shinier. And I mean, Italy at the time is kind of the seat of the Renaissance. It's this beautiful, like, cultural sphere. Like, it has so much beautiful architecture, has all these artists and writers living there. And so Francois really wants a piece of that for himself, for
Mhm.
France, but for himself.
Of course.
So at the Battle of Pavia, he's fighting against the troops of the Holy Roman Empire, the troops of Charles V, and there's just a catastrophic loss on the battlefield. I mean, there's at the time really one of the people who gets kind of the brunt of the blame for it is Marguerite's husband, just because he's an easy scapegoat because he didn't get captured. A lot of the other young men, like Anne de Montmorency, who were by Francois' side, also got captured. So who do we blame? We blame someone who didn't kind of have this like tragic moment of capture. So yeah, Francois gets captured by the Holy Roman Empire. He's French king. It's not really like his life is in danger. Really, what ends up happening is he gets captured, he gets brought on over to Spain, and then held for ransom.
Yes, and this is where Marguerite comes in because when I was reading your thesis, I don't think I ever knew that she was involved in the negotiations to have him released. How did that, like, my mind is blown by this. What kind of
Yeah.
involvement did she have? How did she have any influence whatsoever?
So again, it kind of goes back to the idea of the trinity between Louise, Marguerite, and Francois. So when Francois goes to fight in wars, he makes his mother regent of France. So she's queen regent. And then Marguerite is, again, she's at best a French princess right now. She's not really on the front lines of anything. And then after her brother's capture, her husband dies very soon after. All of a sudden, she's a widow, which gives her, again, a bit more mobility. And after Francois's capture, Louise gets really sick. So she is regent of France. She's been suffering from gout for years. And so obviously, she can't make the trip over to Spain to go and try to advocate for her son. Somebody else needs to go. And again, all these kind of bright young things around Francois are all in captivity with him. Like, there's really, obviously, there would be other people, but there's no one kind of on the level of Marguerite. And also, there's no one who has kind of Francois's trust yeah, she does. Really, he puts a lot of his trust in Marguerite, in Louise, and then in Anne de Montmorency, who is right there in captivity with him. So Anne kind of becomes his guy in Spain at the time, but he needs someone to come over from France who has, is able to get assurances from the government to come over to make sure that like the ransom will be paid. And so Marguerite goes, she gets assurances from the Holy Roman Empire that her passage will be safe into Spain. And she goes. While she's journeying there, Francois gets really sick in his captivity. And then it really becomes a race for Marguerite to be by his side. So something that I feel like is really underexplored about Marguerite is she was very interested in medicine in a way, very much like the caretaker of her family. She's been looking after her mother with gout. She looks after Francois's wife, Claude, whenever Claude gets sick. Later on, she'll look after Francois's daughter-in-law, Catherine de Medici, when she's sick. She is always kind of the nurse at the sick bed. So she has this very close tie to her brother. She's racing to get there to nurse him during his sick bed. She does that. I mean, Francois kind of attributes his recovery to her. Again, whether that was anything she actually did or just her being there, some kind of moral support. That's important, but that's not all she really does there. She's not just the nursemaid, not saying that being a nursemaid wasn't hugely important, but she also meets with Charles V a bunch of times to speak with him and his counselors, to start talking about peace terms and to start talking about the release of the king. She is really funny in her letters. She's writing to Francois, and you can feel her frustration in these letters. And again, like at the time, people are writing things in letters, yes, to each other, but Francois is in captivity. She's not able to write freely and write everything she wants to say because she knows those letters will be read. So the fact that this frustration still kind of goes through these letters just kind of shows you how emotionally involved and charged she was when speaking about that. So she's also there to meet one of the terms that Charles V is really interested in is having his sister Eleonora marry Francois and be the next queen of Spain, because by this time Francois's first wife has died. Or queen of Spain, sorry, queen of France. And at this time Francois's first wife has died, so there's a vacant spot basically. It is, again, really funny again, Marguerite is, at this point, she's really like number two in the French court, like, or maybe number three after Louise, but she's this huge international figure. Before, there were talks about marrying her to Henry VIII. Then there are talks about marrying her to Charles V. Obviously that never comes to fruition, but again, she is kind of seen, yes, on one hand as this like great negotiator, as this nurse, and then also as a marriage prospect. So bringing her over there kind of is also a way to say, okay, here, ball's in your court.
Yeah. Would you say that this was like her first diplomatic mission?
Yeah, it was her first and only one really outside the borders of the French
Okay.
kingdom, which is huge. Like women didn't usually do that. Women traveled for diplomacy in terms of marriage, like when a foreign princess would marry a foreign prince.
Yeah.
But they didn't really travel as diplomats, as advocates for her. For yeah, she traveled again within France at the very famous meeting, the Cloth of the Field of Gold.
Yes.
She is there. She's there when François meets Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. Marguerite is right there. Queen Claude is there too, but she is very pregnant, as she usually was. Poor Queen Claude was always quite pregnant, which is also why Marguerite took on a lot of traditional roles of queen consort because François's actual queen was just constantly in childbed. So that space was kind of opened up for Marguerite in that sense. So yes, she had been a bit of a diplomat before working at these events within France, but this is her first time ever traveling outside of France as a diplomat and treating kind of directly with a foreign monarch on her own. Yes, as representing the king, but she is there on her own doing that.
Right. So she likely had some communication with Catherine of Aragon as well.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. They definitely met at the Field of Cloth of Gold. Thereafter, who could really say? I mean, again, one of those really unfortunate things where you just don't have the sources.
Well,
But yeah, Marguerite communicated with a lot of women, and she was in communication with the English court quite a bit. She especially hit it up with Wolsey, with Cardinal Wolsey. Her and Wolsey really hit it off. At one point, he was calling her like his adoptive daughter and everything after that
what?
meeting. Yeah, they
Wow.
really hit it off. He thought she was like brilliant. So the English court know of her
Yeah.
again based on the fact that she's written to the king and she's written to Colonel Wolsey. She probably was in some form of communication with Catherine of Aragon. Also, then obviously Marguerite is in constant communication with Catherine of Aragon's nephew Charles V. So
Yes. Yeah. Oh, her life is so interesting to me.
yeah,
So we mentioned 1525. We mentioned her husband dying, and now she's free to marry again.
yeah.
And I'm so intrigued by the idea that she ends up marrying somebody that was held captive alongside her brother. Can you go into that?
Yeah, so she gets married to Henry d'Albret, who is King of Navarre. Navarre is this really, it used to be a bit of a bigger kingdom, kind of spanning both sides of the Pyrenees, the mountain range between France and Spain. And back in 1512, it was the whole Spanish side was basically taken over by Spain, which just left the Kingdom of Navarre as this kind of little rump kingdom just on the French side of the Pyrenees. So Henry d'Albret is this king with a very small kingdom. He grows up really alongside François again. He is 10 years younger than them, but he is educated in these same circles. He is one of those, again, like kind of bright stars, upcoming stars of the court of France. So he goes and he fights in the war alongside François, is taken captive as well, is kind of a close, maybe not super close, but close friend of the family.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. Knowing you could be saving money for the things you really want, like that dream house or ride, is a great feeling. That's why the State Farm Personal Price Plan can help you save when you choose to bundle home and auto. Bundling, just another way to save with the Personal Price Plan. Prices are based on rating plans that vary by state. Coverage options are selected by the customer. Availability, amount of discounts and savings, and eligibility vary by state.
Paradise is back
It's finally here.
in a new location, Costa Rica. There will be adventure, drama, and romance,
All gas, no brakes. That's my vibe.
Ready to find some love.
but it wouldn't be paradise without surprises along the way.
These kids need to learn.
That's right, your favorite Golden alums are crashing the beach,
We bring in a party, baby.
Bachelor in Paradise. New Mondays at 8, 7 Central on ABC and stream on Hulu.
Interest. Okay, so what's the benefit then to marry her off to him?
So again, you have to think of it kind of as part of Francois's strategy is he wants to make France bigger. He wants France to be bigger, more international. He wants France to have, he basically wants everything that Charles V has. He wants to be Holy Roman Emperor. Like he wants all of that. He wants that big European empire. He wants France to be the power in Europe. And so with Navarre, because again, it was only 1512 that they lost those Spanish holdings, there's this kind of dream of having the bigger Navarre back together again. So on one hand, the idea that he could do some sort of territory grab into Spain, very tempting to him. And then on the other hand, if that doesn't work out, marrying Marguerite there, I mean, it's great territory. Again, it's its own independent kingdom. Maybe one day it could become a part of the French crown. At the same time, he's giving more resources to Navarre to guard that border. So really, it becomes, about territory. It's all really about territory. And then also, I mean, you can't really. Marguerite, again, was floated on the marriage market. She definitely had some say in who she wanted to marry. And she, by all accounts, was really happy to marry Henry d'Albret. Like, if he wasn't her top choice, I would be surprised. He's young, dashing. He's one of those boys that grew up with her brother that she was exposed to really early in her life. Like, he is basically, I think, what she would have pictured for herself as a kind of ideal husband.
I'm seeing so many similarities here with Francis I and Henry VIII. And of course, Henry VIII wanted France for himself. He wanted to expand his empire. And then when we look at Henry VIII's sister Mary Tudor marrying Louis XII, and then after he dies, marrying Henry VIII's good friend Charles Brandon.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of parallels going on here in these two women's lives.
Yeah, exactly. And then you remember, like, Louis XII was that French king that was king before François I.
Yes.
And the whole time they're waiting, like, to figure out whether François is going to be the new king or not. They're all really worried when Mary Tudor marries Louis XII because they're like, well, she's young. She's probably going to have children. So that means that's curtains for François. So yeah, there's all these really crazy connections when you think about these same kind of people being in these places.
Yes, I love when the histories connect like that and we see those similarities. That is just so fun. Okay, so now she's remarried. She's on her second husband. You kind of alluded to this before, and I'm kind of shifting gears here a little bit about Marguerite as a writer.
Yeah.
When did she begin really writing? Because I know she had work that maybe hadn't been published right away, but had she always been a writer?
Pretty much, yeah. So something that, again, her mother, and her brother did was that they would write each other these things called épîtres, which were these like very personal poems that they would write to each other. And so she is writing these to her family members. She's sending them as letters, but they're these long things of verse poem. So she's writing about that. She's also really early on in about 1517. So basically like almost a decade after she got married, she's engaged in this spiritual correspondence with this spiritualist named Guillaume de Brisonnet, who is, again, he is an evangelist. I'm sure we'll talk more about religion and everything, but Margaret's writing these long, long letters to him about, the human soul and her like understanding of it and her worries about it. And so she really has always been a writer. She just really starts to hone her craft quite a bit later in her life in terms of writing in different genres. But at the time, she's writing a lot of poetry. She's writing about spiritualism. This kind of comes together when François' young daughter, Charlotte, dies. Again, Marguerite, as per usual, is nursing at her niece's bedside. She is sick, I believe, with smallpox. And then this child dies, and Marguerite writes this really long kind of ode to the young girl, and it takes form of a dialogue between her and the spirit of her young niece. And basically it's like, anybody grieving, like she's writing a dialogue saying, well, are you okay? Like, what happens when you die? This and that. And then she's writing, and then she's having her niece speak back to her and saying, I'm happy here, I'm safe here, and giving her kind of instructions for what to do to be able to pass on to the next life as easily. So it's this kind of very tragic but very hopeful piece of literature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I saw that she wrote, what was it, the Heptameron? Is that the right way to say it? I mean, I'm familiar with the Decameron because obviously we all lived through COVID and the pandemic, and I feel like the Decameron really became well known for our generation, present day, during that time period. And what made her decide to do that? Was there something going on with plague or anything during the time where she decided to create this?
So the Heptameron actually isn't set during plague times. It's set in her version. These people get isolated because they're really like stuck in a terrible storm and they're flooded in and stuck in this castle. The bridge has become like completely flooded, so they can't get out of there. And when she is later in her life living in Navarre, she spends a lot of time going to spas for her health. She develops arthritis, and where these spas are usually really off the beaten track around the mountains. So she gets stuck in all these torrential downpours. She is really dealing with these kind of like natural disasters. So for her, her version of it is dealing with the isolation and the fear that comes from being kind of trapped in a natural disaster, trapped in the midst of something you don't understand or know. And again, like she has at least one Boccaccio book in her library. She has On Famous Women. She definitely obviously read the Decameron. I mean, the Heptameron is literally aping it. She, was likely inspired by that, and then also inspired by her experiences as a woman. Like the Heptameron is really a gendered response to the Decameron.
Interesting. I want to talk about some of the other things that she wrote too, and I'm trying to remember off the top of my head because I do not speak French, so I had to use like Google Translate.
That's
But there
fine.
was one that looked like it had her name over and over.
Oh, Marguerite de Marguerite.
Yes, and I was like, is
Yeah.
this just her name? But I want you to go into that.
So it kind of translates to like the pearl of the pearls, basically. Like Marguerite means pearl. And so that's not the name of a work that she actually published herself. It's the name of the volume that was her compiled works of poetry.
Gotcha. Okay.
So she's not just writing odes to herself, but that is the name of her compiled volume of poetry. Yeah, I believe that one is just like a poetry and spiritualist collection.
Okay.
And then later on, she's also writing plays. So she does lots of, again, what starts off as very private, like devotional writing, then becomes very public. Like she writes plays to be staged. And so, yeah, again, like she is writing for publication.
Wow. So the plays that she wrote, were they actually acted at court?
Yes, at least one of them definitely was. I mean, one of them gets basically dedicated to her brother's mistress, the Duchess d'Etampes.
Okay.
And it's really like a dialogue. Again, she's really fascinated in conversations. Like that is a huge preoccupation of her writing, is people talking to each other, having arguments, disagreeing. And so the one that was dedicated to the Duchess d'Etampes was about three women arguing who's having the most misfortune in love. And that one was almost definitely performed at court. I mean, again, it's the Duchess herself appears as a character in the play. Like,
Oh gosh. I want
yeah,
to see this play. I bet that was
yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah. And it's like good. Obviously, it's good for her. It's her writing. It's getting out there. And then it's good like,
Yeah.
she's showing her support for her brother because her brother loves his mistress. Like so she's really like again doing this in a way to kind of gain his favor also. And so it's becoming quite funny. It is quite funny to see like his mistress on the stage. But not never poking fun at her, like again, like exalting her.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. Well, she was definitely a patron of the arts, right? That's a fair
Yes.
statement. We talk a lot on the show about what we call the marketing mothers and the women who were
Hmm.
responsible for having all of these portraits made and making
Hmm.
connections with England or with Spain or whatever it may be. What kind of connections did Marguerite have with artists and maybe like any artists that we would know?
So Marguerite had connections to quite a few artists. I would say, obviously, through her brother, Da Vinci is the big one. Da Vinci kind of gets called to France a bit quite late in his life, and lives at Amboise, which is one of the chateaus that Marguerite grew up in. So she has some contact with him through her brother. The big one, obviously, the thinker Erasmus. Erasmus is writing to her, is talking to her.
Mm,
She has contact, again, more of a religious figure than artist, but she's talking to John Calvin.
okay.
She is really like talking to, there's this Italian woman who is again a spiritualist, a writer, Vittoria Colonna. Marguerite is talking to her. She really is like kind of working on an international frame. Like again, a lot of the artists are very local to France. But Marguerite is working with them. I mean, that is kind of one of the things she's most known for is being a patron and protecting like really hardcore protecting the people that she patronizes.
It's so important when we look at these women in history who had so much involvement in the arts. And I feel like for so long, nobody was talking about it. And now I'm so glad to hear that we're hearing about more of these women from history who were so involved in diplomacy, in the world of art. It's I feel like I'm speechless because I don't
No,
even, I don't.
it's really cool. And like what I love about Marguerite is yeah, she's an artist herself, but she also so much like prioritizes other people's art. Like
Yeah.
that is again a major interest of hers. She grew up in the middle of this giant library collected, I believe, by her grandfather, and then added to by her mother, added to probably by herself as well. You know, like
Yeah.
this is her and François as well, like really become huge patrons of the arts. I mean, when Marguerite moves to Navarre with her husband, she really takes the charge of modernizing their chateaus in Nérac
Mm.
and Po into these kind of Renaissance chateaus instead of these a bit gloomy like stone fortresses.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. So I'm curious, and I feel like maybe I've heard something about this, but I'm going to ask you because you know her better than I do. Did she have a connection with people like Margaret of Austria?
Yes, she did. So Margaret of Austria, I love Margaret of Austria. She's very
Me too.
cool. And so what's really fun about Margaret of Austria is that she actually grew up with Marguerite's mother, Louise of
Oh,
Savoy. They grew up together in the French court. So Margaret of Austria at the time was potentially going to marry the heir to the French throne. So when Marguerite is growing up, she's kind of there. Charles the Eighth that I was speaking about, his sister Anne de Beaujeu is his regent. He's young. Margaret of Austria is potentially going to marry him.
okay.
Obviously, doesn't happen. But she's sent to France to grow up there to learn to become a French queen. And who else is there? Louise of Savoy. So they grew up together in the same household, in the same group of Anne de Bretagne is there too, of like young, educated women.
Yeah.
So Margaret of Austria and Louise of Savoy obviously know each other. They then create the Ladies' Peace later on in the Italian Wars between France and the Holy Roman Empire. Margaret is there when the Ladies' Peace is being discussed. She doesn't have a direct signature on it, a direct hand in it, but yes, certainly has met Margaret of Austria. I believe she has some letters to Margaret of Austria as well. Again, just kind of keeping that contact together as a diplomat.
Yeah, I always feel like when you have women who have a little bit of power, you can see the connections, how they're like talking behind the scenes. It kind of reminds
Exactly.
me of Sarah Griswold's book, Game of Queens.
Oh, such a good book.
Yeah, that was the one where it really opened my eyes. And I
Yeah,
thought, oh, these women were all in cahoots together to try
yeah,
and solve all these men's problems,
yeah,
basically.
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
okay, yeah, exactly. Yes.
Literally,
That's really what they
someone
were.
had to do it.
Yeah. Well, it always seems like the men were so anxious to go to war or so anxious for conquest, and the women were sitting back going, well, this is not a very good idea. We can solve this in a more diplomatic way without fighting. And
No, you just have like, and especially at the time, like you have these three huge egos, these three like youngish men at the time, at the beginning of their reigns,
yeah.
starting out, and they're all desperate to prove themselves, like Charles V, Francois the First, and Henry VIII. They're all, yeah, just desperate to be kind of the king of Europe almost. Obviously, not actually like taking control of every European country, but being known as the one with the most power in Europe. And obviously,
Yes.
we know what happens that it's Charles V in
Yes.
the end. But yeah, that obviously creates a lot of teeth gnashing for both of them. And there's
Yeah.
the whole system of alliances being broken and started and broken and started
Mhm.
between these three kingdoms. And then you have the women who are just trying to mend the fences a lot of the time. And I mean, like, I don't want to go into the thing where it's like women are always peacemakers. Like, of course, women were involved in the conflict as well,
Yeah.
had opinions. I mean, again, like, Margaret really stamped her foot at ever being married to Charles V. She didn't like the guy. She was like, you know what? We don't have to keep our promises to him. That's, you know, she wasn't this perfect kind of scion of peacemaking. But yeah, again, the women did have a lot more influence and a lot more tendency towards peace talks, towards finding
Yeah.
a resolution to conflict instead of starting new ones.
Yes. I'm sorry. I do have a tendency to male bash on the show.
No, I do too. I do too. I love it. I'm not against the male bashing. I'm just like women's experiences can, you know, women can sometimes be warmongers.
Yes. Well,
That's fine.
one thing that has never changed through time is the human condition and the way
Yeah.
people react to things. I mean, that
Yeah.
has stayed true from 500 years ago to now. So,
Yeah.
We gotta stick with that. Okay,
Exactly.
well, when we think about them, like you said, Charles V clearly had the most power out of the three of
Yeah.
them. And then you look at Francis and Henry, and clearly Francis beat Henry in the wrestling match at the Field of Cloth of Gold. So he
Yeah.
was better than Henry too.
Yeah.
What an embarrassing thing to happen.
I know, literally in front of your beautiful wife. And
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yeah, that would have been horrifying. Okay, anyway, I do want to talk about religion and her
Yes.
because I don't think I necessarily understand where she stood because this time in English history, it was like we went from the Catholic Church to now the Church of England. What was going on in France and what was going on with Marguerite?
So France, I would say, is if you look at like the English Reformation as this like very sudden break, France is a bit more of a slow burn. So John Calvin's teachings, which John Calvin is like Calvinism, brand of Protestantism, it starts seeping into France. Most of the French Protestants who are called the Huguenots later on are Calvinists. What happens is Marguerite is in contact with Calvin. She's very interested in him, but Marguerite actually isn't, as far as we know, and I personally don't think she ever was a Protestant. She was always Catholic. What she was really interested in was reform of the church. She thought the Catholic Church was super corrupt. I mean, in the Heptameron, she is writing all the time about corrupt clergymen, monks who abuse women, monks who look for money, like all of this. Like she is very aware. She is an evangelical, obviously not in the same way that we understand the word now, but that's what it's called at the time. They want to reform the Catholic Church. But that doesn't mean that she's anti-Protestant. She spends a lot of her time protecting people who would go on to be burned for heresy. She spends a lot of time protecting people who go on to become like super ardent Huguenots. Her daughter becomes the leader of the Huguenot movement in France. So though Marguerite herself, again, pretty much Catholic through and through her life. If she ever toyed with conversion, there's no like record of that.
Okay.
I mean, a pretty good kind of idea of where she stood is that she was in constant communication with the Pope. So, and the Pope pretty much, stood by her. And she was, again, this kind of divisive figure because she was too liberal in a lot of religious ways for the kind of hardline Catholics in France. And then later in her life, like Calvin's like, come on, get it together. Like, come join us. Like, you're not going far enough. So she is, when you think of her now, she is quite a radical figure in terms of kind of, again, going against the hardline Catholics. But at the time, neither side was entirely happy with her.
And you talked about her connection to Cardinal Wolsey too.
Yeah.
And clearly he was a Catholic and I don't think he really wanted the Church of England to become the thing either because I mean, look where he ended up, basically removed and then dying.
Yeah.
Did she ever comment on him during that time of his downfall? There's nothing.
No, not as far as I know of.
Okay.
Yeah, no, not as far as I know of. And I mean, yeah, again, like I just had a thought and completely lost it, but she's just so interesting because again, she is putting herself out there to save a bunch of reformers. Like she is in some ways putting herself in really untenable positions when her brother has to really appeal to these hardline Catholics. And then here comes Marguerite, who knows her brother loves her and like basically like going on like hand and knee and begging for the lives of people that would be burned otherwise. And I mean, she is like really, this is what I was going to say. What I find really remarkable about her is that she is someone who, while deeply religious, like it's not like she was an irreligious person, was also very tolerant, it seems, of kind of most sides. Obviously, very strong against hardline Catholics and, again, the corruption that she saw in the church. But then at the same time, just because she herself never identified as Protestant, it doesn't mean that she ever created conflict with them. I don't think there's any records of her ever, kicking anyone out of her court. On the contrary, she had John Calvin come and stay with her. Like she was really quite like tolerant from her time and like able to almost separate like her religion from anyone else's. So not having these kind of religious disagreements that obviously were so common then.
Oh, I appreciate that about her. When you see these people who were open-minded when it was such a divisive time when it came to religion, that's really respectful. Yeah,
no, she was like constantly, again, like people seem to dislike her for her stance more than she ever took actions against anyone. Like she again was having people on both sides saying, "Why aren't you on our side?" And she again, meanwhile, was busy, helping religious hospitals, Catholic religious hospitals. She was busy again helping Protestants escape from the country. Her court in Navarre, because it's its own kingdom, becomes a sanctuary for a lot of Protestants who would otherwise be imprisoned or burned in France.
Wow. She, I feel like
Yeah.
I really I need to finish reading your thesis because now I'm even more interested in her and I want to know so much about her life. And,
Yeah.
we don't have an endless amount of time to talk here, but
Yeah.
I feel like I know her a little bit better now
Yeah.
than I did before. Before we get going, though, I do want to talk about the fact that she did become a mother, didn't she?
Mhm. She becomes a mother. So she has a daughter, Jeanne, who becomes, again, after the death of her mother and father, becomes queen, regnant, like queen in her own right of Navarre. Navarre has always allowed for female rulers. Ellie Woodacre has done amazing work on queens in Navarre. And so this is a legacy there. But yeah, so she has a daughter, Jeanne. She has a son, Jean, as well, who doesn't survive long. Like he
Oh,
dies as an infant. So that's, Marguerite, like so many other people who go into mourning at that point, when her son dies, she only wears black for the rest of her life. She is quite devastated by it. She has at least one miscarriage. Other than that, again, what is interesting about her as a mother is that she does have these maternal instincts. I mean, she has her first child when she's 30, which at the time was quite late.
yes.
And so, she's an older woman, and this not really. I mean, I'm 30, and I don't feel like an older woman. But before that, she really wanted to be a mother, so she's writing to people, including Anne Montmorency, who grew up alongside her and her brother, and she's calling him like my nephew and this and that. And it's so funny because she writes to people. It's the convention at the time. She's writing to Guillaume de Brissanet again, who is her confessor. Basically, he is older than she is, but she is calling him my son. She
Mm.
wants to have this motherly connection, and then she really is. Again, Francois is always busy warmongering. Claude, his wife, is always busy being pregnant. And so a lot of times taking care of the royal children falls to her. She spends a lot of time with the royal children. And so what's interesting about her as a mother is that unfortunately she can't replicate the time that she's spent with the royal children as she can with Jeanne. She can't do it. She's too busy with her brother, with her husband, trying to help her husband have Navarre regain its old territory. She's busy trying to retain influence in her brother's court so that she can keep helping these Protestants and these people who need her help. And so her daughter ends up raised again, not really by Marguerite. There
Okay.
is, I mean, I could go on about this forever, but basically, there's completely different thoughts about their relationship, Marguerite and Jeanne. What ends up happening, and again, a fun connection for you, is that when Jeanne is 12 years old, she is married off by Francois to the brother of Anne of Cleves, William, Duke of Cleves, who is older
Oh,
than her. She is 12 years old, um, as far as we know. And meanwhile, Jeanne's parents, Marguerite, and more so her father, Henri, are trying to have her married off to Philip II of Spain because they're thinking they might get Navarre back that way.
okay.
Um, by all accounts, so by Jeanne's own account, she says later on this marriage gets annulled. It doesn't last very long. It gets annulled when Jeanne is 17. Um, the facts are Jeanne never goes to Cleves to join William.
Mm.
The facts are Jeanne has to be carried down the aisle because she doesn't want to go. Um, she writes at the time that she is forced into this wedding. And then I think at the time she also says, my mother forced me into this. My mother beat me. My mother forced me into this.
Oh,
So when you're thinking about it, you're like, how do I square this with everything I know about Marguerite? And then this horrible treatment of her daughter. And then what I find really interesting is again, the Chilakians who wrote this biography of Marguerite actually really argue that Marguerite was in on this and was trying to make it at the time, didn't want her daughter to be married, and so made sure that Jeanne had everything she needed for when this marriage would eventually be annulled or divorced. So when you think about it, this 12-year-old probably isn't going to have these complex legal statements written out about being forced into the marriage. It just probably isn't the case. I mean, I was reading one of the stories in the Heptameron today because I'm interested in writing a paper on it, and in it she says 12 years old is too young to know about the affairs of love in this book that Marguerite has written. So if she's writing this about a 12-year-old, it seems quite unlikely that she would be supportive to the point of forcing her 12-year-old daughter to marry someone. Again, Jeanne is never brought over to Cleves. It's really delayed. Why would that be delayed? Probably because her mother didn't want her to go. So I'm really firmly of the opinion that even though you have these kind of legal documents saying Jeanne forced her 12-year-old daughter into this marriage, it might not be as it seems. It might have been, again, from everything we know about Marguerite, from her own writing, from the relationship that Jeanne and Marguerite would have afterwards, where they seem to get quite close. They write AP to each other. It just doesn't seem like Marguerite actually was necessarily the villain in that scenario, and that what's more likely is that she advocated for her daughter in really the only way that she could.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to close this up with you leaving us with a final thought on Marguerite. Is there anything that you want us to know that maybe we didn't cover, or anything you want to say about her?
Really, I mean, I kind of think I've said like what I really wanted to say about her was to say, like, number one, she was unique for really being tolerant in a way that we don't think of the time period, especially because, you know, the Reformation's happening and then the French Wars of Religion happened not soon after she dies. And so she's this kind of icon in my head of like toleration, of saying, okay, even though we don't necessarily say the same religion, I have your back. The other thing that I really like to pinpoint about her is that, you know, she was a proto, like, a proto-feminist, basically. Like, she, and again, if you ever read the Heptameron, a lot of the book is really interesting because it's about this dialogue between men and women, and them telling stories to each other and then arguing about whose perspective to prioritize in the stories. But then when you read the stories, a lot of them, you know, she's writing about stuff that we're still trying to deal with today, like sexual abuse by like someone in a position of authority. She's writing about like women's freedom, about women's rights, about women's intelligence. She's writing about all kinds of really interesting stuff that kind of just gets couched away and buried because people are like, oh, well, this is a courtly treatise, or this is about courtly love.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily as serious. But she actually was obviously a very serious writer, not just in her religious and devotional poetry, but also in her kind of more like almost farcical stuff. And yeah, so she's just like, I mean, I think she's iconic. I think she's really cool. I mean, I just have to shout out Estelle, for in her book, about Anne Boleyn and her relationship to France. She posits that Anne Boleyn might have met, have kind of worked under Marguerite, and I love that idea. Again, there's no letters confirming this, but I do think that that would have been an amazing connection. And I think maybe even if they never necessarily cross paths in any kind of deep and enduring way, at the same time, I think they're two like strikingly similar women. And I think like that, I mean, I would love to see more work kind of done on Anne's time in France so that we can really get this kind of idea of the networks of women who come together, like you were saying. So we have, yeah, we have a lot of that on some ends, and then obviously not so much on other ends.
Yeah. Well, I know anybody who's listening or watching today probably wants some book suggestions. Can you recommend any books?
Yeah, so there's, again, I've shouted them out a bunch of times. There's the Chilakians who've written, I believe they wrote, I think it's called Marguerite de Navarre, Mother of the Renaissance. They also, Patricia Chilakian wrote a really interesting book. It's more of a literary study on rape and the writing in the Heptameron. So again, like, we didn't even go into this, but really, like, one of her theories is that Marguerite becomes really preoccupied with sexual assault because she might have been a victim herself at some point in her life. So again, really interesting to look from like our current point of view at those books. Pierre Jorda, French historian, he has kind of the definitive biography on her. I would also say, yeah, Sarah Griswood's Game of Queens. I'm pretty sure she devotes some time and space to Marguerite in there. I'm just trying to think. And then there's a lot of, again, because Marguerite It's honestly funny because studying her as a historian, there's not as much work on her because she studied so much as a literary figure. So you have all these great scholars like Scott Francis working on her, Mary McKinley, but they're writing about her from the point of view as an author and looking really at her works. But I think, like most writers, you can learn a lot about her by reading her work. So I would also really suggest just pick up the Heptameron. It's honestly really fun. It's Penguin sells it like as a classics, Penguin Classics.
Okay.
It's a bit of an adjustment to get into, but then once you get into it, you're reading all these stories and you're like, it's actually crazy that someone wrote this in the early 16th century and has all these ideas about like what's right to do to a woman, what's not right to do to a woman,
Wow.
what's, yeah, again, I think the best way to kind of learn about her is to read her own words.
Oh, I'm going to have to run off after this and go start reading myself. Emily, thank you so much for joining me today and teaching us about Marguerite.
You're very welcome.
I think
It was a pleasure.
I'm gonna have to have you back now to talk about the other topic of your thesis, I think.
I would be so happy.
Wow, we'll make it
I
happen
love talking
because
about them.
yeah, they're fascinating. They really are. And you did such a great job today. So thank
Cool,
you.
thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Tudors, Dynasty, and Beyond. If you enjoyed the episode, please take a moment to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so you never miss a new release. And if you loved it, leave a quick review. It helps more history lovers find the show. Want to support the podcast and get bonus content? Head to patreon.com/tutorsdynasty. You can also find the link in the show notes of this episode. Join the conversation with Rebecca on social media at Tudors Dynasty. Until next time.